We are commencing legal action against Mrs. Meghan Markle. Her televised allegations, particularly the Oprah interview, have inflicted undue harm upon the royal family. An apology no longer suffices. The matter will now proceed through the...
The room had been called for a private family discussion, not a public reckoning inside the walls of the monarchy. Yet the moment King Charles lifted a sealed letter from the table, the atmosphere changed. William stopped moving. Camilla stared toward the page. Harry understood immediately what was about to happen. Then Charles began reading Meghan's private words aloud, before the assembled senior royals, and what had been a family dispute suddenly became something far more dangerous. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had summoned the extraordinary closed gathering after weeks of rising tension over private communications between Meghan, Harry, and the palace. Around that table sat members of what royal circles traditionally call the firm, the informal name often used for the monarchy as a working family institution. The meeting was supposed to contain the damage. Instead, the king placed the letter at its center. Charles broke the silence by reading selected passages from Meghan's private correspondence aloud. The words dealt with the monarchy, Harry's position inside the family, and possible future dealings with the palace. One passage described a proposed arrangement in which the Sussexes might appear at selected royal engagements under carefully defined conditions. William reacted immediately because he knew no such arrangement had ever received formal approval. Harry sat rigid as his wife's words filled a room where she could not answer for herself. His shock turned quickly into anger. He believed something intensely private had been dragged into a family confrontation without warning, and each sentence made the humiliation sharper. The prince demanded to know why correspondence meant for a restricted audience was now being treated like evidence. Charles remained controlled, but the strain showed. His hands tightened around the page before he lowered it. To the monarch, the letter represented more than criticism. It suggested that attempts at reconciliation might have been connected to future leverage over royal appearances and access. That possibility made the disagreement feel less personal and far more institutional. Charles then revealed the detail that changed the room again. The letter had not reached him directly from Meghan. A member of the household had raised concerns about its contents before the document was placed before the king. Harry immediately demanded a name. Charles did not answer. Instead, the monarch removed his glasses, placed them beside the letter, and looked directly at his son. "Everyone in that room," he said, "deserved to understand what had been happening privately." Harry's anger hardened. William watched the exchange and understood the danger before anyone said it aloud. The letter itself was explosive, but the mystery of who had delivered it to Charles and why could tear open something even worse. Before Harry could challenge the words on the page, he would have to confront what that same document now meant to every person sitting around him. A royal crisis is never only about the words on a page, it is about the histories those words awaken. To Charles, the letter feels like proof that trust has collapsed. To Harry, exposing it feels like betrayal by his own father. William sees a threat to boundaries he has fought to protect, and Meghan, though miles away, suddenly becomes the invisible presence dominating every chair in the room. One document has struck 4 different wounds at once. Charles carried the deepest institutional fear. After years of division, he had hoped private contact could remain separate from official royal business and slowly create a path toward calmer relations. For the king, that separation mattered, because the palace had to protect private family exchanges from becoming part of negotiations over formal duties. Official royal business means work carried out on behalf of the monarch, and he believed those boundaries were already fragile enough. Harry saw something entirely different. He and Meghan had built much of their distance from palace life around control over what remained private and what became public. Now his wife's correspondence had been read before senior relatives without her consent. He wanted to defend her, yet beneath the anger was something more painful. He still wanted to understand his father. That made Charles's certainty feel worse, not better. William watched his brother with growing discomfort. He disliked the implications inside the letter, especially the suggestion of future royal appearances that had never been formally agreed. But seeing Harry humiliated in front of everyone created another problem. The future king began questioning whether exposing the correspondence in that room had crossed a line, even if the contents raised legitimate concerns. William quietly pushed a glass of water toward Harry. His brother did not touch it. Still, the gesture mattered. Anger had damaged their relationship, but it had not erased every instinct between them. Then Harry looked down at the page again, and his expression changed. Camilla had noticed it too. One sentence suggested Meghan expected certain palace figures to resist any future Sussex role, as though people inside the family had already been divided into supporters and opponents. The Queen Consort wondered how carefully those relationships had been mapped before the letter was written. Harry barely heard the discussion anymore. Thin markings sat beside several passages. Someone had underlined phrases, someone had made notes. The copy Charles held had clearly been read or reviewed before reaching him. His fury shifted instantly. This was no longer only about why his father had read Meghan's letter aloud. Someone else had handled it first. William saw disbelief replace anger on his brother's face, and the room understood the danger at the same moment. Those markings pointed backward to a restrained encounter weeks earlier, when one seemingly ordinary conversation had quietly set the entire disaster in motion. The letter did not appear from nowhere. Weeks before Charles ever held it before the family, Meghan had entered a private conversation, believing she was drawing a boundary. Instead, that exchange created the sentence that would later shake the palace. Everyone remembered the meeting differently. One side called it an attempt at clarity, another saw it as pressure. But one precise moment changed everything, and afterward, there was no realistic path back to silence. Meghan joined a private video call after communication between the Sussex household and the palace had cautiously reopened. The discussion centered on whether Harry might attend selected family occasions without returning to a formal working role. A working role meant carrying out official duties on behalf of the monarch, something neither side was proposing. Palace advisors wanted that distinction protected because even a small public appearance could quickly be interpreted as a wider institutional agreement. Meghan listened until the conversation reached a proposed family appearance at Windsor. Then her tone changed. She told a senior palace intermediary that Harry should not be invited privately, welcomed emotionally, and then presented publicly as though his place inside the family had simply vanished. To her, that was the point of contradiction. She believed the palace wanted the emotional benefit of his presence without acknowledging the unresolved pain surrounding his departure. Meghan ended the call, but the argument stayed with her. She remained seated for several seconds, then opened a blank document and began typing. What started as an attempt to clarify her position became the private letter that would later dominate the family meeting. She expanded on the Windsor disagreement, questioned how future appearances would be framed, and warned that silence could itself create a misleading impression. Charles received a written summary of the call that evening. The king read it alone, pushed the page aside, then pulled it back toward him. He had hoped the tentative family gesture might create calmer ground. Instead, questions of status, visibility, and precedent had returned immediately. To him, something meant to be personal was beginning to look dangerously close to negotiation. The situation became explosive when Meghan's letter followed. One crucial passage expanded directly on the Windsor argument, but the version moving upward through palace channels contained internal annotations. Someone had underlined phrases and attached comments before the correspondence reached Charles. Charles realized the copy had traveled beyond its intended recipient. That discovery hardened his response. The king no longer saw only a disagreement between relatives. He saw evidence that private communication was being interpreted, circulated, and reshaped inside the institution itself. So he summoned the family meeting. By the time they gathered again, nobody was discussing a hypothetical dispute. Charles had the annotated letter in his hand. Harry knew a boundary had been crossed, and once the king began reading, confrontation was no longer avoidable. Harry does not wait for another paragraph. The moment Charles reaches for the second page, his son interrupts him. One word, "enough," cuts across the room with more force than any raised voice. For years, father and son have argued through statements, interviews, advisors, and distance. Now there is nowhere to hide. No spokesperson can soften what follows. No prepared line can contain it. The conflict has finally become exactly what everyone feared: personal. Charles keeps his hand on the letter. The king believes he has every reason to continue, because the correspondence does not deal only with private hurt. It touches proposed arrangements involving the monarchy itself. Those arrangements matter because anything linked to official royal activity can affect precedent the way an earlier decision can influence how similar cases are handled later. To him, that makes the letter impossible to treat as purely personal. Harry rejects the distinction immediately. He pushes his chair backward and stands, his anger no longer contained by ceremony. A private letter, he insists, remains private even when royal subjects appear inside it. Meghan trusted those words to a restricted exchange, not to an audience. His voice breaks slightly when he says her name, and for a moment the fury reveals something more vulnerable underneath. Charles does not surrender the page. He folds it once, slowly, and places it beneath his hand. The monarch tells his son that trust cannot work in only one direction. If private communication begins shaping expectations about future royal decisions, he argues, those affected cannot be expected to remain blind to it. Harry stares back at him. Trust, he says, cannot survive humiliation either. That sentence strips away the institutional language completely. The argument is suddenly no longer about protocol, correspondence, or future appearances. It is about a father who believes he is defending responsibility, and a son who believes that defense has come at the cost of dignity. William finally intervenes. The prince does not defend Charles, and he does not excuse Harry. Instead, he asks the question that has been hanging over the room since the markings were discovered. Who supplied the annotated copy? Charles pauses. The king reveals that the document reached him through an established palace channel, carrying a warning that its contents might affect future royal decisions. A palace channel is simply an official internal route used to pass sensitive material between senior offices. But Charles refuses to identify the individual who sent it. Harry's expression changes again. His father is withholding a name. William notices it too. For the first time that evening, the brothers are no longer studying each other with suspicion. They are looking toward the same institution. The family's pain has finally exploded into the open, but now the struggle shifts somewhere colder. Someone controlled the movement of Meghan's letter. Someone decided Charles needed to see it. And if the king is protecting that person, the next battle will not be about emotion at all. It will be about power. The loudest moment of the night belongs to Harry. The most consequential one belongs to Charles. After the confrontation, the king does something almost unnervingly calm. He closes the letter, asks everyone to sit down, and draws a line between family privacy and royal responsibility. That distinction becomes his defense, his authority, and perhaps his greatest gamble. Because Charles is not merely deciding whether the letter should be discussed, he is deciding who gets to define what counts as private. Charles understands that, as monarch, he controls access to official royal discussions and carries final responsibility when personal disputes begin affecting institutional decisions. That authority matters because private family contact can remain personal only until it begins shaping expectations around official appearances, public roles, or palace commitments. William has enormous influence as heir, but even the future king cannot simply overrule his father. He can question, advise, and challenge. He cannot make the final call. Charles feels the cost of that power almost immediately. During a brief break, he remains behind with Camilla while the others leave the room. The king presses both palms against the table, and admits that he knew reading the letter would anger Harry. What he did not expect was evidence that the correspondence had already moved through several hands. His certainty begins to crack because the problem is suddenly larger than the argument he believed he was controlling. Camilla watches him carefully. The Queen Consort tells Charles that he may win the argument and still lose the relationship. She reminds him that Harry is not hearing an institutional defense. He is hearing his father justify exposing Meghan's private words. The king does not answer immediately. His silence reveals the fear beneath the authority. He is trying to prevent another unresolved dispute from destabilizing the family. Yet every step toward control seems to push his son farther away. Charles returns to the room with a colder decision. He orders that no further copies of the letter circulate, and demands an internal account, a formal record explaining how sensitive material moved through palace offices, of exactly how the annotated version reached him. William then receives the detail that changes the scale of the breach. At least 3 individuals handled the copy before Charles ever saw it. The prince realizes Meghan's words had traveled much farther inside royal channels than Harry imagined. What had looked like one questionable handover now resembles a chain. Harry learns none of this calmly. Before the evening ends, he receives confirmation that someone outside the room already knows a precise passage from the letter. His anger turns into alarm. Charles can lock the document away now. He can restrict access, demand answers, and order silence. But he cannot reverse where the words have already been, and within hours, that failure of containment begins reaching Harry and Meghan directly. Meghan learns what happened not from the palace, but from Harry. His call comes after the meeting, his voice still carrying the anger of the room he has just left. He tells her Charles read the letter. Then he tells her something worse. The copy contained annotations. There is a long silence. For Meghan, the argument is no longer about royal protocol or family tension. Someone else has entered a conversation she believed belonged to her. Harry moves into an empty corridor before continuing. He lowers his voice and recounts exactly what Charles read, where William intervened, and how the room changed when the markings became visible. The palace has already begun an internal containment process, meaning access to the correspondence is being restricted, while staff record who handled it and when. But none of that answers the question waiting at the other end of the call. Meghan asks whether Charles read the entire letter. Harry hesitates. That pause tells her enough. He eventually admits that several key passages were read aloud, including the section about future family appearances. Meghan says nothing for several seconds. Her first reaction is not rage, it is stunned quiet. Then she asks the question Harry has been dreading: who else saw it? He cannot answer. Harry feels the failure personally. His return to the family meeting had placed him in the room when Meghan's private words were exposed, yet he had been unable to stop it before the damage was done. He tells her he challenged his father, but the explanation sounds weak, even to him. The prince knows, defending her afterward cannot erase the fact that the words were already heard. Meghan's anger finally surfaces when Harry describes one handwritten annotation beside a passage. The phrasing strikes her immediately. She remembers seeing similar language in earlier palace communications formal wording, used when concerns were passed between senior offices. That does not identify one person, but it narrows the possibilities. Someone familiar with those internal channels had likely handled the letter. William reaches a different conclusion, at almost the same time. The prince tells Charles privately that the central crisis is no longer what Meghan wrote. It is whether royal machinery mishandled private correspondence and then allowed the family to turn that breach into a confrontation. The king does not dismiss him. He knows the distinction matters. William then makes an unexpected decision. Exhausted by suspicion and determined to understand what happened before another argument erupts, he contacts Harry and asks him to meet the following morning. No Charles, no Meghan, no advisors, no staff. By morning, the battle has changed shape completely. What began as father against son is about to become something far less predictable. Two brothers sitting across from each other with no institution left between them. There are no aides, No private secretaries. No prepared notes. When William and Harry sit opposite each other the next morning, they are not the heir and the estranged prince for a few fragile minutes. They are brothers who have spent years interpreting each other through anger. William does not excuse the letter. Harry does not excuse everything Meghan wrote. But for the first time in the crisis, neither man begins by defending a position. They begin by admitting what hurt. William arranged the meeting because he no longer trusted the family to solve the breach through official channels alone. A private secretary is a senior aide who helps a royal manage official work and communication. But the prince deliberately excluded everyone. Harry agreed only after his brother promised that nothing said between them would be turned into a formal palace position. For once, there would be no statement waiting at the end of the conversation. Harry speaks first. He tells William that watching Charles read Meghan's letter awakened the fear he has carried for years, that private family pain can become institutional material whenever someone decides it is useful. He admits the humiliation was worse, because Meghan was not there to explain the context herself. The prince does not ask his brother to agree with every word. He asks him to understand why the exposure felt like betrayal. William listens, then answers with his own fear. The future king says some passages frightened him because they made future family contact sound tied to questions the monarchy could not casually negotiate. He believed private reconciliation was becoming mixed with expectations about public recognition. Yet even as he says it, he hesitates. Hearing the letter read aloud had made him uncomfortable too. Harry gets up after the exchange turns tense and reaches for the door. William asks him to stay. The request is quiet, almost awkward. His brother pauses, then returns to the chair. That single decision changes the conversation. William finally reveals what Harry did not expect. After the meeting, he challenged Charles directly and argued that the unauthorized circulation of Meghan's correspondence was a separate wrong. Disagreeing with its contents did not justify allowing private words to travel through multiple hands. Harry is visibly surprised. He then admits something of his own. Meghan wrote the letter in anger after the Windsor conversation, and some passages were intentionally forceful. They were not meant as a formal demand for royal power. For the first time, the brothers find common ground. William and Harry agree that Charles should acknowledge one clear fact publicly. The correspondence was private, and should never have circulated beyond its intended route. That agreement does not heal years of division. It does something more immediate. It gives the king a way out. And now Charles must decide whether protecting the institution means defending what happened, or admitting that the palace itself crossed a line. By midday, the argument inside the palace has escaped its walls. The public does not know every sentence in Meghan's letter, but it knows enough. Charles confronted Harry with private correspondence. The family erupted, and questions now surround how the document circulated. Suddenly, a deeply personal dispute has become a national spectacle. Yet one image captures the mood better than any headline: a crowd gathering beyond Buckingham Palace, while broadcasters repeat the same extraordinary phrase, a private letter read before the firm. Charles watches the coverage privately and realizes how badly control has slipped away. The firm is the informal term often used for the royal family as a working institution, but the public is no longer debating structure or procedure. It is debating privacy, loyalty, and whether a father used royal authority to expose his son's wife. Palace communications stress that no complete copy of Meghan's letter has been released, hoping to prevent her private words from spreading any further. Meghan sees the story differently from thousands of miles away. Headlines reduce the letter to its most confrontational passages, stripping away the anger and context that shaped them. She tells Harry that whatever she intended when she wrote those words has now been overtaken by the spectacle surrounding them. He agrees, but neither can ignore the deeper problem. The letter is no longer only theirs. Outside Buckingham Palace, the pressure becomes impossible to dismiss. A broadcaster stands before a growing evening crowd and lifts the next morning's front page toward the camera. Across it runs the headline, "Private Words, Public War," with photographs of Charles and Harry placed on opposite sides. People gather behind the reporter. some defending the king, others condemning the decision to read the correspondence aloud. The family argument has become a national symbol. Charles sees that exact moment on television. The king reaches for the remote and turns the screen off, just as the front page fills it. He remains silent afterward. What he intended as an internal reckoning has become a public judgment on his relationship with Harry, and royal authority cannot undo that transformation. William's intervention begins circulating inside palace circles at the same time. The prince has made his position clear. Disagreeing with Meghan's words is one issue. Accepting responsibility for how the document traveled is another. That distinction increases pressure on Charles, because even his heir now believes the breach cannot be buried beneath the family dispute. Charles finally makes a decision. He will bring Harry back into the room one last time, but this time, the letter will remain closed. The final meeting will not decide whether Meghan was right or wrong. It will decide whether the king can admit that exposing her private words carried a cost no title, protocol, or royal authority can erase. The letter lies on the table again, but nobody reaches for it. That detail says everything. Charles has already read enough. Harry has already heard enough. William has already watched one family argument become a national crisis. This final meeting is not about proving who was innocent, because nobody leaves untouched. It is about deciding what the monarchy will learn from the moment. And when Charles finally speaks, his conclusion is more personal than anyone in the room expected. Charles keeps the gathering deliberately small. Only Harry and William sit with him, because the king no longer wants a wider audience turning a family wound into an institutional hearing. He confirms that the letter will be removed from active discussion and that access to private correspondence will be tightened. Internal handling rules, the procedures controlling who can receive, copy, or pass sensitive material, will also be reviewed, so another private exchange cannot travel through palace channels unchecked. Harry listens without interrupting. When his father finishes, the prince makes his position clear. He may never agree with Charles's interpretation of Meghan's words, but disagreement did not give everyone in that earlier room ownership of them. The letter was written privately. Reading it before senior family members transformed a disagreement into humiliation, and no later restriction could fully erase that moment. Charles does not retreat from everything. The monarch tells his son that parts of the letter genuinely alarmed him because they appeared to blur private family contact with expectations around future royal involvement. He still believes those concerns required an answer. Then his tone changes. Reading the passages before the entire firm, he admits, was the wrong way to confront them. Authority gave him the power to do it. That did not make the choice wise. William quietly supports the distinction. The future king does not declare Meghan's words harmless, and he does not dismiss his father's concern. Instead, he says two truths can exist together. The letter created legitimate conflict, and exposing it before the family deepened that conflict unnecessarily. For the first time, nobody tries to defeat the other truth. Charles reaches for the pages at last. He places them inside an envelope, seals it himself, and pushes it away rather than toward Harry. No passage, he says, will be released or quoted further. The document will no longer be used as ammunition. Harry looks at his father. The hurt has not vanished, but the fight has. He gives a small acknowledgement before standing to leave, and that becomes the final verdict. Charles learns that authority cannot force trust back into existence. Harry learns that private anger can create consequences once it touches royal structures. William proves that loyalty does not require blindly choosing a side. And Meghan's letter, once the weapon at the center of the room, becomes the reason the family finally defines the boundary it should never have crossed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.